All right. So how exactly does a message kind of propagate through a neuron? So how do we receive these sensory messages from, say our eyes, for example, to our brains? And this actually happens in the neurons through what's called an action potential. And you can sort of see these steps of an action potential broken down into the six numbered steps below. And what basically happens, and we're gonna go over this in more detail in the coming slides, but we see a stimulus trigger a dendrite. So remember, the dendrites of the neuron are those are kind of the short finger-like extensions that receive sensory input. What happens is the neuron becomes depolarized, and we're going to go over what this means shortly. The message travels down the dendrite, through cell body, and then down the axon, the long extension of the cell body. The neuron then repolarizes, and then we see propagation across different neurons through what's called neurotransmitters that are located at the end of the axon of one neuron. And they're released that then trigger the dendrites of the next neuron, and it kind of moves forward in a wave like that. Oops. And so here we can start to see, more in detail. So first, our dendrite is triggered. So here we are on, our neuron. So we have our cell bodies. So remember, the short ones are going to be dendrites that accept that sensory input. The long one is our axon. It has axon-specific terminals. And so at rest, the neuron is what is called polarized, or the neuron has a overall net positive outside charge. So you see all these positive sodium ions here. And this is basically what makes these positive and negative charges is sodium and potassium ions. And so this is why sodium and potassium are very important to get as vitamins, because if you don't have enough sodium or potassium, you could have issues with how your nerves are functioning and actually interpreting those signals. And so basically, the polarized neuron is more positive outside than inside that axon portion there. Now, our second step is depolarization. So a certain stimulus causes depolarization of the neuron's membrane. And so let's say we get input from a sensory organ, so like our eyes or our nose, right? So a stimulus causes depolarization. So a depolarized membrane allows the positive Na ion to flow inside the membrane. And so the positive charge starts going into that neuron, that cell. And this causes an action potential in the neuron. So we see a flowing of positive ions into the cell and depolarization of that membrane, causing a net negative charge outside the cell and a net positive charge inside the cell. And this sort of moves forward like a wave. And so you see that we have continuing depolarization and generation of the action potential as it moves down that axon. And then we have what's occurring repolarization, where we have kind of a reset of that net positive charge outside. So they return to a polarized state. So the nerve impulse continues to move from the dendrite through the cell body and down the axon via the action potential. And then the neuron repolarizes. And so the direction the nerve message is traveling is down the axon here. So I think in your notes it asked the question, what is an action potential? And an action potential is the depolarization plus repolarization moving along an axon, sort of like a wave. And we're talking about it, in terms like this is a wave that we can actually recognize. This is actually extremely fast. So it takes about 1 millisecond, 1/1000th of a second for this action potential to move across a particular axon. And then once it gets to the end of those axon terminals, impulses are able to cross what's called the synapse, or the space between neurons, so between cells in the nervous system, and it transmits this signal via a special chemical called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are released from a nerve's axon terminals, and once the neurotransmitter is perceived by the dendrite of the next neuron, it becomes stimulated, and the process of the generation of the action potential, right, the depolarization and repolarization in that wave, starts all over in that neuron. And so it goes again and again until it reaches the CNS, or the motor neuron that causes muscle contraction, or whatever the case may be. And so here's kind of a close-up view of how neurons kind of communicate at synapses. And so you see that we have a receiving neuron and we have a transmitting neuron. And when it does receive that specific signal at the axon terminals, it releases that special chemical, neurotransmitters, into the synapse, which is this portion that's between the transmitting and receiving neuron. They have special receptors that then open up to allow that depolarization, or that flowing in of that positive sodium ion. And so I find, when I teach this material, that a lot of people are interested in, what is pain? And I think this is a wonderful YouTube video that kind of explains what pain is. And so if you'd like to learn more about pain and how we interpret that as far as the nervous system, go ahead and take a few minutes and watch this YouTube video about pain. And in the next section, we'll get into what reflexes actually are and how we go about processing that information.